Now you are explaining yourself. They wanted chaos, and now you are participating in it. This is why intelligence in human relationships is not simply knowing what to say. It is knowing when not to enter the game. A toxic person may present you with an invitation disguised as an attack. They say something designed to make you prove yourself. They question your character. They make a disrespectful remark and then wait for you to defend your dignity. They create a problem and then watch how quickly you rush to solve it. The inexperienced person responds immediately. The strategic person pauses. That pause can change everything. You do not have to answer every accusation. You do not have to correct every false statement. You do not have to defend yourself against every interpretation someone creates about you. Sometimes the strongest response is to observe what the person is trying to accomplish before deciding whether their words deserve your energy. This does not mean becoming passive. It means refusing to react blindly. There is a difference between weakness and restraint. Weakness is being unable to respond. Restraint is having the ability to respond, but choosing the response that serves you best. A toxic person often wants you to believe that immediate action is necessary. They create urgency. They demand explanations. They insist that you answer now. They want you emotional because emotional people make decisions they later regret. Do not let someone else's urgency become your urgency. Take your time. Think. Observe, then choose. Ask yourself, what exactly is happening here? Is this person trying to solve something, or are they trying to provoke something? Is this conversation moving toward understanding, or is it becoming another cycle of accusation and defense? What happens if I refuse to participate? These questions shift you from reaction to strategy, and strategy begins with recognizing that not every battle has equal value. Some conflicts deserve a clear response. If someone has genuinely crossed a serious boundary, you may need to speak firmly. If your reputation, safety, work, or important relationships are being affected, silence may not be the smartest choice. You can communicate facts, establish boundaries, and protect yourself without becoming consumed by the conflict. But many smaller provocations do not deserve the same investment. Someone makes a sarcastic comment. You do not have to retaliate. Someone tries to make you jealous. You do not have to perform indifference. Someone attempts to drag you into gossip. You can refuse to participate. Someone demands that you justify a reasonable decision. You can calmly repeat yourself and stop explaining. The smartest way to deal with toxicity is not to defeat the toxic person at their own game. It is to refuse to play a game that was designed to drain you. This is where observation becomes your advantage. When you stop reacting immediately, you begin noticing patterns. You see what topics repeatedly trigger conflict. You notice when kindness appears only after they need something. You notice how they behave when they hear no. You notice whether apologies lead to change or merely reset the cycle. You do not need to announce these observations. You simply remember them. Because patterns are more revealing than promises. A person may tell you that they respect you, but watch what happens when you establish a boundary. A person may say they hate drama, but observe whether they repeatedly create it. A person may call themselves honest while constantly changing their story when confronted. Do not waste your energy trying to force someone to admit what their behavior already demonstrates. Believe the pattern. This is one of the smartest forms of self-protection because it removes the need for constant confrontation. You stop trying to convince people to become different. Instead, you adjust your own level of access, trust, and involvement according to what they repeatedly show you. And this is where your power begins to return. You no longer need to win every argument. You no longer need the final word. You no longer need to expose every manipulation. You no longer need to make a toxic person understand that they are toxic. Your responsibility is simpler. Protect your judgment, your boundaries, your time, and your peace. A toxic person can only pull you deeply into their world if you allow their behavior to dictate your attention. So before you respond, pause. Before you defend yourself, observe. Before you enter the battle, ask whether the battle deserves you, because the smartest way to deal with toxic people is not to become better at fighting them. It is to become better at recognizing which battles they will never be able to pull you into. The moment you stop allowing a toxic person to control your emotions, the entire dynamic begins to change. They may still speak loudly, they may still criticize you, they may still attempt to provoke you, but their behavior loses its greatest weapon, your immediate reaction. This is where emotional control becomes one of the smartest forms of self-protection. You are not trying to become cold. You are learning to create a space between what someone does and what you decide to do about it. A toxic person often studies reactions without consciously admitting that they are doing it. They discover what makes you angry, what makes you defensive, what makes you insecure, and what makes you chase their approval. Once they understand those pressure points, they can return to them whenever they want to shift the balance in their favor. They say something insulting and you defend yourself. They withdraw affection and you chase them. They criticize you and you begin explaining, they accuse you, and you start proving your innocence. They become distant and you become desperate for reassurance. Notice the pattern. The other person moves one piece and you move yours automatically. That is influence. And if you want to deal with toxic people intelligently, you must break the automatic response. The first impulse is rarely the best one. Anger wants immediate expression, fear wants immediate reassurance, pride wants immediate retaliation, insecurity wants immediate explanation. But you do not have to obey the first emotion that appears inside you. You can feel anger and remain silent for a moment. You can feel insulted and still choose your words carefully. You can feel rejected without chasing. You can feel misunderstood without desperately trying to control someone's opinion. That pause is where your freedom exists. A toxic person may expect a predictable version of you. They know that if they push a certain button, you will react in a certain way. The moment you stop following that pattern, their ability to manipulate the interaction becomes weaker. Imagine someone deliberately makes a disrespectful comment in front of other people. Their goal may be to make you lose your composure. If you explode, they can point toward your reaction, and suddenly the conversation becomes about your anger instead of their behavior. But if you remain calm and say, "That was unnecessary," you have changed the entire atmosphere. You did not surrender. You did not attack. You simply refused to give them the emotional performance they were trying to create. This is not about pretending that disrespect does not affect you. It is about deciding that another person's behavior does not get automatic access to your nervous system, your attention, or your decisions. There will be moments when you genuinely need to respond. Emotional control does not mean allowing people to mistreat you without consequence. It means responding from intention rather than impulse. Sometimes the strongest sentence is direct. Do not speak to me that way. Sometimes it is better to leave the conversation. Sometimes you need to document what happened and address it through the appropriate channel. Sometimes you need to end contact. The strategy depends on the situation. But whatever you choose it after the emotion has settled enough for you to think clearly. This is especially important when a toxic person tries to create urgency. They may demand an immediate answer. They may say, "If you cared, you would respond right now." They may accuse you of avoiding the issue simply because you refuse to argue while emotional. Do not let their urgency dictate your timing. You are allowed to say, "I'll discuss this when we can have a productive conversation." Then step away. You have not lost. You have established a condition for communication. And there is something else you must understand. Emotional control is not the same as emotional suppression. If you constantly swallow anger, resentment, and disappointment without processing them, they eventually accumulate. The goal is not to pretend that everything is fine. The goal is to understand what you feel without allowing the feeling to make every decision for you. After the interaction, ask yourself what actually affected you. Was it disrespect? Was it fear of rejection? Was it embarrassment? Was it the feeling that you were not being valued? Understanding the emotion makes it less mysterious. Once you know what someone triggered inside you, you become less vulnerable to the same trigger in the future. This is why self-awareness is a form of defense. A person cannot easily manipulate a weakness you have already recognized and learned to manage. If you know that criticism makes you desperate to prove yourself, You can pause before explaining. If you know that rejection makes you chase, you can step back. If you know that conflict makes you angry, you can delay your response until you are calm. You are no longer discovering your weaknesses in the middle of a confrontation. You already know where they are, and this changes your presence. You become calmer without becoming passive. You become firm without becoming aggressive. You become less predictable to people who depend on provoking you. Most importantly, you stop confusing reaction with strength. Anyone can shout, anyone can insult, anyone can retaliate. Real strength is having enough control to choose the response that protects your long-term interests. A toxic person may still try to pull you into chaos. Let them try. Your advantage is not that they stop behaving badly. Your advantage is that their behavior no longer determines who you become. When someone cannot control your emotional reaction, they lose one of the easiest ways to control the interaction. The smartest way to deal with a toxic person is not to convince them to respect your boundaries. It is to decide what you will do when they refuse to respect them. This is where many people misunderstand boundaries. They think a boundary is a warning given to another person. You better stop doing this. But a boundary is not really about controlling someone else. It is about controlling your own participation. You cannot force another person to behave well. You can decide what you will tolerate. You can decide what you will respond to. You can decide what access someone has to your time, your attention, your personal life, and your emotional energy. That distinction changes everything. A toxic person may ignore your first request. They may laugh at your boundary. They may tell you that you are being too sensitive. They may accuse you of changing. They may even attempt to make you feel guilty for protecting yourself. This is where weak boundaries collapse. You explain yourself again, then you begin defending the boundary as though it were a court case. But the more you argue about your boundary, the more you turn it into a negotiation. You do not need a 10-minute explanation to say no. You do not need to prove that your feelings are reasonable before you are allowed to have them. You do not need someone else's agreement before you decide what behavior you will accept. A simple statement can be enough. I am not comfortable with that. I won't continue this conversation if you speak to me disrespectfully. I cannot do that. I've made my decision. Then comes the most important part, consistency. A boundary without consistent action is only a request. If you tell someone you will leave a conversation when they become insulting, and then remain for another hour arguing, you have taught them that your boundary has no real consequence. If you say you will stop answering abusive messages, then continue responding every time they provoke you, your behavior contradicts your words. People learn from patterns. They pay attention to what you repeatedly allow. This does not mean you need to punish people every time they make a mistake. Human beings are imperfect. Someone can lose their temper, apologize sincerely, and genuinely change. The intelligent person distinguishes between an isolated mistake and a repeated pattern. A boundary should create room for accountability, not demand perfection. But when the same behavior continues after the boundary has been clearly communicated, you have new information. The person is not merely unaware. They are choosing not to respect the limit. At that point, more explanation may accomplish very little. Your response should become behavioral. Reduce access. In the conversation, stop sharing personal information. Limit contact, refuse to participate in predictable arguments. If necessary and appropriate, remove yourself from the relationship or environment. The power of a boundary comes from what you do, not from how strongly you announce it. This is especially important with people who enjoy turning boundaries into debates. They may ask, why? You explain. Then they challenge your explanation. You provide another reason. They challenge that one. Soon, the original boundary has disappeared beneath a mountain of arguments. Do not allow this. You are not required to win a debate before you are allowed to protect yourself. Sometimes the strongest response is simply, because that is what I have decided. Then stop. Silence can protect the boundary better than another paragraph of explanation. There is another mistake people make. They set boundaries only after reaching a breaking point. They tolerate small disrespect for months, remain silent, and then suddenly explode. Now the other person focuses on the explosion instead of the behavior that created it. This is why boundaries should be established early and calmly. You do not have to wait until you hate someone before you distance yourself from them. You can notice discomfort early. You can communicate early. You can adjust access early. You can prevent resentment from becoming the only language left between you. This is not cruelty. It is maintenance. Think of your attention and emotional energy as resources. If you allow someone to repeatedly drain them without consequence, eventually you will have less patience for everyone else in your life. The toxic relationship does not remain isolated. It begins affecting your work, your confidence, your relationships, and your ability to think clearly. That is why boundaries are not merely about protecting yourself from another person. They are about protecting the quality of the life you're building. And once you understand this, you stop feeling guilty every time you create distance. You realize that saying no to one person can sometimes mean saying yes to your own peace. You realize that ending one destructive conversation can protect an entire day. You realize that refusing one unnecessary argument can preserve energy that belongs somewhere more important. Most importantly, you stop trying to control the toxic person. You cannot control whether they become angry. You cannot control whether they understand. You cannot control whether they call you selfish. You cannot control whether they tell others that you have changed. But you can control your participation. That is where your real authority exists. A boundary becomes powerful the moment you stop using it to change someone else and start using it to govern your own choices. There comes a point when explanation has reached its limit. You have observed the pattern, controlled your emotional reactions, and established your boundaries. Yet the toxic behavior continues. This is where many people make another mistake. They believe they must confront the person until the person finally understands. They keep returning to the same conversation, repeating the same explanation, hoping that one more argument will produce a different result. But sometimes the smartest move is not another conversation. It is distance. Distance is not always an act of anger. It can be an act of clarity. When you create distance from a toxic person, you remove yourself from the environment where their behavior repeatedly pulls you into the same cycle. You stop giving the conflict new opportunities to consume your attention. Think about the pattern. They provoke, you react. They defend themselves. You explain, they twist your explanation, you defend yourself again. The conversation continues until both people are exhausted. Yet nothing has actually changed. Why return to the same battlefield? If a person has already demonstrated that they are unwilling to have a productive conversation, continuing to argue does not necessarily create understanding. Sometimes it simply gives the conflict more oxygen. Distance changes the conditions. You may answer less often. You may stop participating in unnecessary arguments. You may keep conversations focused on practical matters. You may stop sharing personal information that can later be used against you. You may choose not to respond to provocative messages immediately. And in some relationships, you may decide that the healthiest option is to leave entirely. The important thing is that distance should be deliberate rather than dramatic. You do not need to announce, "I am cutting you off so you can understand what you lost." You do not need a final speech. You do not need to create a public confrontation. You do not need to make your departure a performance. If someone has consistently shown that access to you creates more chaos than value, reducing that access can speak for itself. This is especially powerful because toxic people often depend upon continuous engagement. Their influence grows when you keep explaining, defending, arguing, and reacting. Every additional conversation gives them another opportunity to change the subject, distort the issue, or provoke another emotional response. Distance removes that opportunity. But there is a difference between healthy distance and silent punishment. Silent punishment says, "I want you to suffer because I am refusing to communicate." Healthy distance says, "This interaction is no longer healthy for me, so I am reducing my involvement." One is about controlling the other person's emotions. The other is about protecting your own. That distinction matters. If you step away while constantly checking whether the other person has noticed, you are still psychologically attached to the conflict. If you disappear only because you want them to chase you, then your distance is still centered around them. True distance gradually turns your attention elsewhere. You return to your work, your goals, your relationships with healthy people, your responsibilities, your own development. The toxic person becomes less important because your life becomes larger than the conflict. This is why distance can be uncomfortable at first. When you have spent a long time inside a chaotic relationship, peace can initially feel strange. You may feel guilty. You may wonder whether you were too harsh. You may feel tempted to return simply because the absence of conflict feels unfamiliar. Do not mistake familiarity for health. A chaotic environment can become familiar without becoming good for you. Sometimes people return to toxic relationships because they miss the intensity, not because the relationship has improved. They miss the arguments, the reconciliation, the emotional highs and lows. The constant feeling that something is about to happen, but peace does not always produce the same intensity. Peace can feel boring when your mind has become accustomed to chaos. Give it time. Your nervous system needs space to learn that calm is not emptiness. There is also wisdom in limiting what a toxic person knows about you. Not everyone needs access to your plans, your fears, your ambitions, your relationships, or your vulnerabilities. When trust has been repeatedly violated, continuing to provide personal information is not kindness. It may simply be poor judgment. You can remain polite without remaining exposed. You can remain professional without becoming emotionally available. You can be respectful without becoming intimate. You can communicate without revealing everything. This is strategic distance. And sometimes it is the only way to coexist with someone you cannot completely avoid. Perhaps you work together. Perhaps you share responsibilities. Perhaps you live in the same community. Perhaps circumstances make complete separation impossible. In those situations, the answer is not necessarily total disappearance. It is controlled access. Keep communication clear. Keep it relevant. Keep emotion out of unnecessary exchanges. Do not provide material for another argument. Do not gossip about them. Do not try to recruit everyone to your side. Simply become consistent. The less emotional chaos you provide, the less room there is for the conflict to grow. And eventually something changes. You realize you do not need to win. You do not need them to admit they were wrong. You do not need them to apologize. You do not need them to understand why you left. Your peace becomes more important than their agreement. That is the real purpose of distance. Sometimes the smartest way to defeat toxic behavior is not to fight it harder, but to remove yourself from the environment where it has the power to reach you. One of the greatest mistakes you can make when dealing with toxic people is allowing their chaos to become your identity. They may provoke you, distort your words, spread their version of events, or attempt to make other people question your character. And if you react carelessly, you may find yourself spending more time defending your reputation than living your life. This is why protecting your reputation requires more than simply avoiding conflict. It requires discipline. A toxic person may understand that they cannot control you directly, so they attempt to influence how others perceive you. They tell a story before you have the opportunity to tell yours. They present themselves as the victim. They describe your boundaries as arrogance. They describe your silence as hostility. They describe your distance as evidence that you are the problem. If you become emotional, you give their story additional material. You become angry. You send long messages. You confront everyone who heard the story. You begin explaining yourself to people who never asked, and suddenly, the toxic person's behavior has pulled you into a performance. You are now trying to prove that you are not what they claimed you were. This is exactly where composure becomes a form of protection. You do not need to chase every rumor. You do not need to answer every accusation. You do not need to convince every person. Your reputation is built over time through patterns of behavior, and a single person's description of you does not automatically erase years of evidence. Let your consistency become louder than their accusations. If you are calm, Remain calm. If you are professional, remain professional. If you have always treated people with respect, continue doing so. Do not allow someone else's chaos to convince you to behave in a way that contradicts your own standards. This is difficult because human beings naturally want to correct false impressions. When someone says something unfair about us, the instinct is immediate. I need to explain what really happened. Sometimes explanation is necessary, but excessive explanation can weaken your position. There is a point where defending yourself stops being clarification and becomes desperation. Learn to recognize the difference. If someone important needs factual information, provide it clearly. If a serious accusation affects your work, safety, responsibilities, or relationships, address it through appropriate channels and keep evidence when necessary. But when someone is simply trying to provoke an emotional battle, do not give them the spectacle they want. Facts are stronger than emotional speeches. A calm statement is stronger than 10 angry messages. And consistent conduct is stronger than endless arguments. This becomes especially important when dealing with people who want to recruit others into their conflict. They may approach mutual friends and tell them their version of the story. They may attempt to create sides. Do not rush to build your own army. You do not need to turn every relationship into a courtroom. Speak to the people who genuinely matter. Tell the truth without exaggeration. Take responsibility for anything that is genuinely yours. Then stop. There is tremendous strength in being able to say, "This is what happened," without adding unnecessary attacks. You do not need to destroy another person's reputation to protect your own. In fact, attempting to destroy them may make you appear more consumed by the conflict than they are. Let them reveal themselves through repetition. People eventually notice patterns. If someone constantly has enemies, constantly has dramatic stories, constantly claims that everyone else is dishonest, selfish, jealous, or disloyal, eventually observant people begin asking questions. You do not need to announce the pattern. Let time reveal it. This is one of the hardest disciplines because patience rarely feels satisfying in the moment. You want justice now. You want everyone to understand now. You want the truth to become obvious immediately. But human perception does not always work on your preferred schedule. Sometimes the most powerful response is simply to continue behaving with consistency while another person exhausts themselves trying to create chaos. Protecting your reputation also means becoming careful about what you reveal. Do not give sensitive information to people who have repeatedly demonstrated that they cannot keep it private. Do not share every plan before it becomes reality. Do not reveal every insecurity to someone who has previously used vulnerability as ammunition. Not everyone deserves access to your private world. Trust should be earned through behavior. And when trust has been broken repeatedly, reducing information is not paranoia. It is discernment. There is another important principle. Do not become obsessed with being misunderstood. Some people will misunderstand you. Some will believe rumors. Some will interpret your boundaries negatively. Some will decide that your silence means arrogance. You cannot control every interpretation. If you attempt to manage everyone's opinion of you, you will become a prisoner of public perception. Instead, focus on the people whose judgment genuinely matters and the standards you have chosen for yourself. Your goal is not universal approval. Your goal is integrity. When you know who you are, you do not need every person to agree with the story. And when a toxic person realizes they cannot provoke you into damaging your own reputation, their influence becomes smaller. They may continue speaking. Let them. Your job is not to compete with their noise. Your job is to remain consistent enough that your behavior becomes difficult to contradict. The strongest defense against manipulation is often not a louder voice, but a cleaner pattern of conduct. Protect your reputation not by fighting every person who speaks against you, but by becoming so consistent that time has little choice but to reveal the difference between your character and their accusations. There is a point where the smartest response to a toxic person is no longer another strategy, another explanation, or another attempt to make them understand. It is detachment, not the cold, theatrical kind of detachment where you secretly hope they suffer without you. Real detachment is quieter. It is the moment you stop allowing another person's behavior to determine your peace, your confidence, your attention, or the direction of your life. This is the final lesson, because everything that came before it leads here.